My name is Heather Richmond. I am honored to be here as a member of the Energy Summit Planning Committee, as well as part of the Energy Accelerator, a program funded by the U.S. Navy that uses Hawaii as a testbed to accelerate some of the most exciting energy technologies we have here. Since we're waiting for a few people to come in, I'll tell you a little bit more about the Energy Accelerator briefly. We have a number of our team members here. I'm based here in Menlo Park, and we take both go-to-market stage and demonstration stage projects over to Hawaii and really look at meaningful and validating pilots to do with our energy community in Hawaii. I'm here. The executive director, Don Lippert, is here in the front. If there's anybody interested in learning more about that, we'd love to talk to you at the reception. And look, that worked. All right, here we go. So again, good afternoon, welcome. Innovation is an amazing process. At the end of the innovation process, hopefully you are left with a game-changing technology, a disruptive process, or possibly a combination of the two. But no matter how fantastic this new innovation is, you ultimately need somebody to buy it. You need customers. The market for innovative energy technologies changed dramatically when DoD and specifically the Navy jumped in and became a customer, a really big customer. In 2009, the Navy set aggressive energy goals, including reduce petroleum use in their 50,000 commercial vehicle fleet by 50% by 2015. By 2020, Navy will produce 50% of their shore-based energy from alternative sources, and 50% of Navy installations will be net zero. By 2020, 50% of total Navy energy consumption will come from alternative sources. I'm excited to hear how that one's going. But a critical part of meeting these goals is ensuring that defense acquisition policies and procedures create pathways rather than roadblocks, something that Secretary Perry has spent a great deal of time on. Assistant Secretary Dennis McGinn has taken that baton and in concert with Secretary Carter and Secretary Mabus continues to move the needle. I am honored to kick off the final session today where these two pioneers of energy will share with us how they are working to strengthen the partnerships between the military and the Valley, between our nation's largest energy user and the thousands of innovative energy technologies being developed right here. Please help me warmly welcome Secretary Bill Perry and Assistant Secretary Dennis McGinn. This is Perry coming up first. Secretary Perry, a few remarks?
Sure.
Perfect.
Good afternoon. You've had a great day here today. You learned about many interesting developments in the energy field. I'm going to sort of step back, though, and try to look at this from maybe at 40,000 feet. What does the energy developments in the last few years look like from 40,000 feet? And I think the bottom line that I have is I believe we have turned a corner, a very significant corner in that time. And to a large extent, this has been because of the fracking developments. But there have been other important developments as well, but certainly fracking has led the way. In the area of natural gas, it of course has turned us from an importer to an exporter. It's brought the prices down and held them down for a good many years now. And I'd like to look for a moment at what I think are the important side effects of those developments, which you're all familiar with. First, not obvious, but I think it's happening, is it's substantially increased the competitiveness of the United States in manufacturing, particularly in those industries where energy costs are an important part of their cost of doing business. That's been an important factor, and it's going to continue to be an important factor. Secondly, for better or for worse, I think it has killed the nuclear renaissance. It wasn't too many years ago we were talking about the nuclear renaissance, and it actually got off to a pretty strong start a few years ago. But nuclear apparently cannot compare with generating power from natural gas. And that, along with the other problems in nuclear, have kept it down. My feeling now is that we're not going to see this renaissance development. I think it is in a stillborn category. It has certainly increased competitiveness for solar and wind. Notwithstanding that, I think solar and wind will survive, and I'll have more to say about that later. In the case of oil, it has taken You know, for decades, we have talked about making the United States energy independent. Nobody knows quite what that means, and there's not really a good definition of it. But whatever it means, where we are today is pretty close to being North America energy independent, which is a very significant development from many points of view. The second and related factor to that, it has, I believe, shattered the power of OPEC. That was certainly manifested at the most recent OPEC meeting, but I think it's going to be true for a long time to come and maybe for the indefinite future. Third, it has put Russia in a very deep hole. Russia is fundamentally a petrostate. They had an opportunity when oil was running over $100 a barrel for many years. They had an opportunity with all the surplus they were accumulating to use that surplus to diversify, but they did not do that. As a consequence, they're still a petrostate. And they're a petrostate whose government runs on profits from oil. And when oil is running over $80 a barrel, they're in good shape. When it's under $80 a barrel, they're eating up their surplus, which they've been doing for the last couple of years now. I have more to say about Russia, but I think that's a fundamental development as a result of the oil developments in the United States, primarily through fracking. Going back to solar, in spite of the difficulty of competing with power from natural gas, solar continues to thrive, and most importantly, they continue to go down on the learning curve. And I see a bright future ahead of us for both solar and wind power. They have survived this competition from natural gas, and I think they're going to continue to thrive. One of the ongoing problems with solar and wind power is they only, of course, generate electricity for a limited number of hours a day. And so they're not suitable for being a grid all by themselves. They're suitable for contributing to a grid. But there are some applications, very important applications, where this time limit is not a serious issue. I want to take just one example today, which I think will be an increasingly important example in the future. Those of you who live in California may have noticed that we've been in a drought for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, and God knows how long it's going to continue in the future. This is basically a desert state that has survived a long time and thrived a long time because of water we bring down from the mountains. But at our present level of population and industry, and at the present kind of rainfall we're getting, that's not enough. The obvious solution to California's problem is desalinization. Besides, I mean, what California has lots of are mountains and ocean. And we've been counting on the mountains to provide the water for the last 100 years or so. But we can also use the ocean. The problem with desalinization is it's too expensive. But a big part of the expense of desalinization is the energy costs. So I think it seems to me a natural solution to California's problem, particularly in the southern part of California, are desalinization plants along San Diego, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, powered by solar. Here, the time limitation of solar is not an important handicap. So you can imagine that as solar power costs go down, that it might become attractive to use it as a power for desalinization plants. And if we could actually do that and start building many desalinization plants, not just a few, then we can start get the economies at scale on the desalinization too. And it's entirely conceivable that we could beat the cost problem in desalinization. So that may be a very bright future ahead for California, for the desalinization industry, and certainly for the solar industry. I will make a brief comment about another source of power, which is biomass, which has been characterized by one failure after the other in the last few decades. My confident forecast is that we are on the verge of a major breakout in biomass, and it's going to become an important part in just the next few years, become an important part of our energy future. The supply of biomass is essentially infinite, and the supply is very cheap. So if we indeed have solved the technical problems of converting the biomass to energy, then we have a huge source of low-cost power there as well. So that's a sort of a rundown on some of the various developments now and in the future in the energy field. I think there's some significant national security implications of all of this. If indeed the power of OPEC is shattered, then I think there's going to be a very important implication on Mideast politics. And the Mideast, as some of you may have noticed, has been the source of our problems and wars and difficulties for many decades now. I've already mentioned Russia. This is going to have a profound effect on Russia. And depending on whether I'm in an optimistic or pessimistic mood, I think this is either good or bad. The good part of it is they'll have less discretionary dollars for causing problems. The bad side of it is it may push them back into a corner and they might do something desperate. Whichever way it goes, it's going to be a very important national security implication. And finally, I want to repeat again what I've already mentioned. There's a potential of the United States making a resurgence in manufacturing, bringing much of our manufacturing back home, particularly that manufacturing which is power intensive, where our companies have a very substantial advantage over most of our competitors in the manufacturing field. Now, with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn the floor over to Admiral McGinn, and with a few questions, first of all, to start him off. The first question, any comments he wants to make on the national security implications, which I've talked about. Secondly, I would like to hear from him, and I'm sure you would like to hear as well, what the Navy is doing in the energy field. It's a big consumer of energy, an important part of their mission. In my opinion, of the various services, the Navy has led the pack in the initiatives they have taken in the energy field. So maybe, Admiral, if you could start off first of all by giving us a quick rundown of the more important actions in the Navy today, then move from there to talk a little bit about the national security implications of energy. So I'll turn it over to you, Des.
Good, thank you. Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, everybody. By the way, we'll be passing out a test at the end of the session, and you'll get credit for it if you pass. Secretary Perry has presented a context, that 40,000-foot view that he described of all things energy that we need to always consider and how we can shape that existing energy portfolio in a way that does good things for our national security, measured in the traditional ways of our economy, our diplomatic power, and of course our military power. He also, from that 40,000-foot view, provided a good geopolitical context in which our Navy and Marine Corps team operates. And in terms of thinking about Navy and energy and innovation and partnerships, especially partnerships with the great folks here at Stanford and Silicon Valley writ large, how we can shape that energy future in a way that enhances our national security in those three dimensions, as well as enhances our quality of life. And not just our quality of life as Americans, privileged to live in this wonderful country, but how we can use our technology, our economic power, our diplomatic power to go after some of the root causes of unrest throughout the world. As many of you may know, more than 1.5 billion people don't have electricity, don't have any electricity. And this can cause a lot of issues, certainly on a human scale, but also on a security scale as well. We in the national security business, and Secretary Perry is a great example of it, get paid not just to read the headlines of today, but to look far into the future, because it takes a long time to build the kinds of national security capabilities, be they economic or military, that will protect us in a future security environment. And this long-term view is always based on a long-term view looking in the rearview mirror. And in the case of the Navy and the Marine Corps, that mirror extends back 239 years. All of the forms of energy, except that which can be produced locally in a distributed way, wind, solar, biomass come to mind clearly, but all of the fossil fuels require free commerce around the oceans of the world. And that is one of the fundamental missions of the United States Navy and the Marine Corps, to make sure that whether we're importing gas or exporting it, whether we're importing petroleum and petroleum products or exporting the goods from a rejuvenated industrial base in America can produce, we need to have free commerce and free access to the seas and to the countries that are our friends and allies, and those that we want to make our friends and allies. So if you think back in this rearview mirror, the Navy has transitioned our energy portfolio many, many times. We went from sail to steam in about the middle of the 18th century, or 19th century, 1800s. We transitioned in that steam from wood to coal to oil. In the late 40s, early 50s, we made nuclear power because we needed it to extend the life underwater of our submarines, and then we said it can be applicable in the right measure for surface ships, and oh, by the way, created the technological base on which our nuclear industry, providing about 1/5 of our total electricity today, relies. So we know about energy. We have an engineering culture. We know about national security globally and the need to make sure that we think long-term ahead. So what we are doing here in 2015 is having some immediate near-term effects, but it will have much, much longer-term effects. And I'll tell you, first of all, the why we should care about energy from a Navy and Marine Corps perspective. Indeed, all of the armed services of the United States and our allies. And then we'll talk about the what's, and then we'll open it up to what may be on your mind or answer any questions that you may have. The why is that we have made those transformations in energy because it makes us a more effective warfighting force, whether that extends the time between refuelings of ships at sea or airplanes not having to go to the tanker as often so they can maintain surveillance and cover for troops on the ground, or whether that is a shore establishment that in many cases these days with global communications may be supporting direct combat action halfway around the world, and you can't afford to have the lights go out. So the idea of distributed generation is really important. But it's all about increasing warfighting effectiveness. In the case of the Marine Corps, Marines operate in forward, austere bases. They are more vulnerable the more they rely on diesel-powered generators to produce their electricity that is essential for all of the operations and missions that they do. But we can reduce that burden. We can make our logistics dependency much, much less by putting renewable energy forward, by putting technologies that provide the same mission impact or more in better, more energy efficient packages. So the why we in the Department of the Navy, and indeed the Department of Defense, are interested in changing the energy equation, changing our energy portfolio, is because, number one, it increases our mission effectiveness. It increases our operational efficiency, and we get more bang for the buck, if you will, out of every barrel of liquid petroleum or liquid transportation fuel or every kilowatt hour, measured in mission effectiveness and, in many cases, quality of life. So that's the why. And we are really, really serious about doing the what's to make sure that we are addressing that goal of increasing mission effectiveness and making sure that our operational efficiency is as good as it possibly can be. It starts with energy efficiency wherever we can do it, whether that's light-emitting diodes instead of other forms of lighting in a forward operating base manned by Marines in a very austere environment. It means stretching the range of our aircraft by the way we load them, by the way we fly them, the profiles, by the way we design them. It means making sure that we know how much fuel we are using at any given time, and we have choices from the commanding officer right on down to the seaman on the deck plates and the engineering spaces about what we are doing in terms of energy and how it directly relates to our combat effectiveness. We are making sure that we are expanding our portfolio of choices. Bill Perry mentioned biomass and the impending revolution. We, about 3 months ago, went out working with the Defense Logistics Agency, which buys for the Department of Defense all of our energy, our fuel, with a solicitation to provide biofuel blends for our ships and airplanes, starting anywhere from 10% biofuel up to 50% biofuel blended in with petroleum, so that we help to create an industry that gives us choices. It doesn't take an Army division to defend a farmer in Iowa, and I'm not just talking about corn here. We're not doing anything that's going to have an adverse effect on our food supply, but all of the wonderful possibilities of using cellulosic material, biomass, to help meet our transportation needs. We are in a time of great blessing of energy, and that's what Bill Perry just outlined. The fact that we have shale technology, fracking, that we have an abundance of natural gas and oil that will extend for perhaps many decades. But remember, in national security planning, you don't get paid for looking at the next quarterly report or the next annual report or even the next election cycle. You get paid for looking far down the road at what is the likely scenario that you're going to be operating in. And with over 7 billion people inhabiting this planet, which isn't growing at all, and higher demands for quality of life and economic vitality, going to more than 9 billion by the middle part of the century, we see demand going up for traditional sources of energy of all sorts, and the supply gradually getting more expensive, more difficult, and oh, by the way, a higher cost, not just in direct economic cost, but a cost to our environment, locally, regionally, and certainly globally with greenhouse gas. So it is with that long-term view that we want to expand our portfolio of energy to include biofuels for our transportation needs, to make sure that for our shore installations and for those Marines forward deployed, that we can use the sun, we can use the wind, we can use biomass, we can use geothermal, whatever source has a compelling business case that it is going to increase our mission effectiveness and our operational efficiency. That's what we're all about. And we have a lot of programs, a lot of partnership right here in Silicon Valley with various firms. There's the Makani Wind Project. There's a lot of power management systems. We work with the Energy Accelerator that was mentioned before, especially in Hawaii, looking for ways to increase the the diversity of our energy portfolio for things that move and installations that demand electricity that is going to be there when and where you need it. Finally, you hear the term microgrid, distributed generation, used very, very much in the modern context. We recognize that our grid, as Thomas Edison envisioned it, but oh, by the way, he first started with a microgrid in Manhattan, but the grid that we have today that meets most of our energy demands is vulnerable to Mother Nature, certainly, and it certainly is vulnerable to mechanical failure or operator error, but it's also a potential vulnerability, if we just assume business as usual, to intentional acts of terrorism or for whatever reason, people putting the lights out. So we want to make sure that we, certainly in the United States Navy and Marine Corps and in the Department of Defense, are taking measures that increase our energy resiliency, our energy security, by more distributed generation, by using microgrids, by having better sensors, by getting this wonderful blend of megabits meeting megawatts in ways that make us smarter in how we get our energy and how we use it. So that's just a couple of framing comments, and I'm going to join Bill Perry and put my feet up and listen to what's on your mind in the way of questions. Thank you. I don't know whether we have microphones, but okay, we have a microphone. If you'd just raise your hand and.
I've been, Jim Sweeney, I've been impressed by how the degree to which the Navy has used what I consider motivational and behavioral techniques to encourage competition for energy efficiency.
Right.
Could you talk a little
Sure.
bit about some of those things that the Navy has done?
It's a great question, Jim. We tend to start conversations about energy with technology. I mentioned some of it myself, whether it's sail power or nuclear power or microgrids or what have you, biofuels. And that's good, but there are two other essential components to us being able to take that long-term view and really make a difference. And one of them is partnerships. Partnerships especially with companies and organizations and individuals represented here. Partnerships across government with the Department of Energy, to name one, Department of Agriculture for another one for biofuels, with the state of California, the Energy Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, the Governor's Office. We are doing all of that. So technology and partnerships. And to Jim's point, culture. Culture is an essential part of us being able to do what we need to do. And that culture, if you really boil it down to a couple of essentials, it is educating our workforce, our men and women, our sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines, to truly understand and value energy for its direct contribution, its essential contribution to warfighting effectiveness and to operational efficiency. And so we've done a couple of things. The Marine Corps, about 4 months ago, issued a letter from the Commandant of the Marine Corps that went to all Marines, and it was called the Energy Ethos. It basically said, Marines, energy is essential to us being an effective warfighting force. You need to value it in garrison when you're at Camp Pendleton or when you're at Camp Lejeune or anywhere you're around the world, Okinawa. And you need to value it when you're in the field, whether that's in combat or training for combat, and really understand how you as an individual Marine and as Marine units going up the chain of command can really make a difference. Because if you think about the energy in units of energy like you do ammo or bullets or missiles, you're going to get the right mindset. On the Navy side, the same thing. We are creating from the highest levels of admirals and senior executives on down to seamen and airmen on the deck plates, this idea that energy warriors really understand and value the direct correlation of energy and what they can do about it and how they can best use it for warfighting effectiveness and quality of life. So we recognize that you have to have a value proposition that basically appeals to what I would call enlightened self-interest. What is in it for me as a ship commanding officer? What is in it for me as a squadron commanding officer? So we started tracking, we measured, we did a lot of metering and measuring. And it's the old expression, you tend to manage what you measure. We're measuring a lot. And we're sharing that measurement, and that gets the old competitive juices going. So Squadron A knows what Squadron B is doing, and Squadron C, in terms of how much training and readiness they're getting out of their allocation of flying hour dollars, or ship steaming days, or days in the field in the case of Marines. And it is causing individual and organizational behavior changes where the culture is changing, and it starts with really understanding what the value proposition is and how being an energy warrior, having that energy ethos, can really make a difference in your ability to conduct that mission.
Thank you.
Hi, John Giddings with the Tech Angel Group. So I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, and there's a lot of them, they have ideas that they'd like to solve problems that the military has, but it's a long path, you know, to getting to that first volume sale. And as an investor, I kind of, the right thing for me to do is to say, you know, forget about that, you know, forget about focusing on the military. But their hearts are in it, and I hate to do that. You know, I would like them to kind of turn them loose, you know, to find at least what is the fastest critical path towards that. So companies that have, you know, things like personal energy or water purification, water delivery, things like that, what advice, you know, could you give me to pass along to kind of say, okay, here's where there's the most likely chance of daylight?
First of all, I would say the Department of the Navy, Department of Defense is open for business. We want to look for innovative ideas. We recognize that we operate under a fairly thick layer of bureaucratic rules and regulations called the Federal Acquisition Regulations, but we don't want to let them stand in our way as an excuse. We want to create opportunities for conversations where we say things like, don't delude yourself that the Department of the Navy knows exactly what we want in energy. We don't. You can quote me on that. We do know we want a better deal. We want more bang for the buck. We want more energy efficiency. So in talking with companies large and small, and we talk across the whole spectrum of company size, explaining what we're looking for, some of our challenges, and try to match those with the opportunities provided by the technology companies. So we're putting out a big demand signal. And it isn't just, hey, come back and see us you know, when you're revenue positive in 10 years or what have you. It's how can we work through our Office of Navy Research, how can we work with incubators like Energy Accelerator? How can we work with our small business office? How can we help make introductions of your technology companies with some of the big defense aerospace, the traditionals? How can we introduce them to the Honeywells and Johnson Controls and Siemens of the world that are long-standing energy service companies? So there's a variety of ways, and it's all about getting the good ideas into the right context.
Good to hear.
And price matters.
I'm Ripu Malhotra from SRI. You both mentioned the role that the Navy has played in energy transitions in the past so many times. And so as we look forward to, and also the urgency to get to non-carbon sources, I know you gave us the light water reactor. Thank you very much for that. What about the new modular reactors? I know you talked about the stillbirth of the nuclear renaissance, but maybe there are opportunities in forward operating bases. Are we planning on those? Are we doing anything in that?
It's a good question, and I think Secretary Perry points out that there's a tremendous amount of economic pressure on the nuclear industry because of the availability and the low cost of natural gas that can provide much, much cleaner, still not as clean as nuclear, energy. Right. Now, let me get directly to your question on small modular reactors. I would describe our position as in the listening mode at this point. We're not making investments. I've talked with Secretary Moniz at the Department of Energy about this, and there needs to be, if we want to get serious, define the requirement for small modular reactors. The Defense Science Board, which Secretary Perry is well familiar, has a task force that started up about January to look at is there a requirement and is there a potential of meeting that requirement with small modular reactors for forward operations. But Secretary Perry, I'd be interested in your thoughts about some of the potential risks of a wider dispersal of nuclear power in forward areas.
Well, I thought for a number of years, last 4 or 5 years maybe, that small modular reactors was a way forward for the nuclear industry. But if I look at what's actually happened in the last 4 or 5 years, what investments people are willing to make in them, what investments the DOD is willing to make in them, I don't see much forward motion. And therefore, I stick by my other earlier statement with this nuclear renaissance. Renaissance is rebirth. I think the baby has been smothered in the crib by fracking. I hope I'm wrong about that, but that's my estimate.
One of the things that we could consider is what factors could change that analysis. And one of them could be if we recognize that we really, really need to put a price on carbon because we're paying it already. We're not pricing it properly. So if we truly put a price on carbon, the good news is natural gas produces only 50% roughly of the greenhouse gases of coal. The bad news is natural gas produces 50% of the greenhouse gases. So if we take into consideration, and then there's the whole life cycle of natural gas from fracking and potential of the very powerful effect of methane on the atmosphere, atmospheric warming. If we take that into consideration in wise policy ways, I think that that could be a breath of life, if you will, to the right kind of nuclear energy. Now, you look at nations like China, in some cases some of the European nations, they're still investing in nuclear energy. We have roughly 5 new builds in some various stage of construction here in the United States, but probably those are going to be offset by the decommissioning of inefficient or uneconomical nuclear power plants that exist now. So we are in a period of waiting and watching, if you will, but there are some companies, the Department of Energy has used their loan guarantee authority for a couple of companies that are building small modular reactors that are what we call passively safe. If you take a typical nuclear plant from the old days, if something bad happened, you'd have anywhere from 30 minutes to 60 minutes for an operator to intervene and do something. In a case of Fukushima Daiichi, there was not that opportunity. There are some of the newer nuclear reactors that has stretched that time of cogitation and monitoring out to 24, 48, even as long as 72 hours. In the case of some of the designs that we have seen for small modular reactors, not for deployable, but for here in the United States, it basically is indefinite. They're inherently passive even when something happens in a failure.
I agree. I agree completely with Denny that if we could get a carbon pricing program in the United States, that would be a game changer for nuclear energy. I stick with my forecast, though, because I'm very pessimistic that we're going to get the carbon price. I strongly support it. I've been a proponent of it for years, but I see very little forward motion in that area. It seems to be a political third rail.
In the back.
Hi, thank you all very much. I'm Frances Sawyer. I'm with FAR LLC, And you've mentioned biomass several times, and I was just down at Fort Stewart where they're integrating energy production with their pine plantation management. And I know that's Army, but I was wondering how you're thinking through using the Department of Defense's land base as a potential source for the energy itself.
I think you're at Fort Stewart, Georgia, and there's a component of the Army's energy production down there that does rely on woody biomass, I believe, right?
Yes, exactly.
Right. And you're wondering if that's more widespread in terms of interest across Navy and other services?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and then also how the land management of the bases themselves is being integrated into energy production, whether that's putting solar installations that are larger than rooftop.
Where it makes sense, and the Army is in a lot of places where it makes sense, where you have that so-called wood basket. Fort Stewart down in Georgia is one. Fort Drum in New York is another, where they have a wood-fired thermal power plant. But in a lot of places, it just doesn't work. And I want to just emphasize, the Army nor anybody in the federal government is into the clear-cutting business to turn trees into electrons. It's using wood waste or products from normal lumber that we are very, very careful stewards of the natural environment at sea and, of course, ashore as well. And so where it makes sense, where you have the asset, we're going to use it. We're down in, we have a Marine Corps logistics base in Albany, Georgia. We've got a partnership with a large paper plant down there, Procter & Gamble, that we're using some of their waste material and excess energy to power our Marine Corps base there.
Great. Thank you.
We make ethanol today from corn, which is kind of a stupid thing to do, considering the cost of corn and considering the value of it as a food product. But it's also true that the corn cobs, the biomass, the corn cobs, have something like 80% sugar content. If we could find a way of breaking down the recalcitrants that keeps us from getting that sugar out of the corn cob, then we'd have a huge, millions of tons of cheap biomass material that would make a lot of economic sense to be making alcohols out of that sugar. And so that's the holy grail as far as energy is concerned from biomass, is finding a way of getting the sugar, breaking it out of the recalcitrants and thereby being able to use these millions of tons of waste biomass material for energy. That's what I was referring to.
A company I'm familiar with, Biodeco, located in an area I'm very familiar with from my flying days down in the Central Valley at Lemoore Naval Air Station, uses a variety of waste biomass, some of it grown, some of it just other waste products, to make a high-quality drop-in biodiesel. And that's one example here in California, but there are others that are springing up across. And by us sending a market signal, we are here, you build it and we will come, that really helps a lot, if the price is right.
My name is Andreas Corellis, and my question is, it's been really incredible to see the Pentagon and the Department of Defense come out over the last few years and say climate change is a massive threat to the national security, and we as the military are going to lead on investing in clean energy and really doing all the amazing things you guys have talked about. At the same time, it seems to me, I've read that Congress has, in a number of attempts recently, tried to limit the military's ability to both study climate change, the scientific research into it, and also the investments into some of the solutions that you're talking about. And I think from a broader perspective, here you guys are both talking about a price on carbon. How can the military be saying, this is a massive threat to our security and this is what we need to do, and yet the Congress is not even agreeing that this is a reality in terms of a threat and trying to limit the military's ability to keep us secure? What can the military do to try and change that conversation in Congress?
Well, I'll start, and I'll be very interested in Secretary Perry's thoughts on this. There was a Republican congressman, Roscoe Bartlett, very, very smart guy, voted out of office, unfortunately, a couple of years ago. And he had a saying, he said, "The ignorance and naivete of the American people about all things energy is a truly great example of representative government." And we are confident that, yeah, there's partisan politics and all of that, but we are at a place now where we've reached critical mass about what we're doing in terms of alternative energy, renewable energy ashore, biofuel. We have powerful business cases. I'll use an example not directly related to the Navy, but it illustrates this business case. There was an outfit that was trying to influence state legislatures, in this case Kansas, to do away with renewable portfolio standards because it was bad for the economy in Kansas, et cetera. It was, really pretty much a done deal in the legislature and with the governor. And it was a business community in Kansas that said, wait a second, this has really been good for us. These policies, renewable portfolio standard, modest though it may have been, has made a difference. And we have value chains that did not exist before. We've got Kansas farms that have wind turbines on them that are producing real revenue, and this business is good. So there are many cases in our portfolio, if you will, in the Department of Defense, where the business cases, especially if you expand it, we're not just doing it for mitigation of climate change. That certainly is a benefit. We're doing it for mission effectiveness, and we're doing it for operational efficiency.
I think there's some reason to hope that the Department of Defense and the military's vigorous program in renewable energies will ultimately influence the Congress. But it's likely to be a slow process, I'm afraid. I think we're about out of time now, aren't we, Jim? Yeah. Yeah.
Would you like to summarize, Mr. Secretary?
I'll turn it over to you to summarize.
All right, great. The summary is, this is a time of great opportunity. I'm a glass half full kind of person. Sometimes you work in the Pentagon and you think you're a paid professional pessimist. But I am optimistic, as are many, many, many of my colleagues in uniform and in the senior ranks. And we are, in fact, open for business because it's the right thing to do for the United States Department of Navy, Department of Defense. And oh, by the way, to the extent that we are able to provide that leadership example, to be that market-opening customer that will benefit the United States in terms of getting more and better informed policy at the federal level, that's a good thing. That's an added benefit. But we are serious. We're going to press on. How many people have ever heard of this thing called GPS? You wouldn't have been able to find this place without it, right? We've become so dependent. Well, that was because the Navy and the Marine Corps, Navy and Air Force collaborated on this elaborate, precise timing satellite constellation, and it was for military purposes, and lo and behold, look what it's done. It's literally revolutionized parts of our economy. And this same phenomenon is going to be taking place in terms of how we shape our future energy portfolio. And we can continue to be the greatest nation in the world because we are looking long range, we're making the right kind of investments, we're creating the right kinds of partnerships, we're changing our culture through education and seeing that this is the right thing for us to do.
My final word is that sometimes I get terribly discouraged with how slow and inefficient our government is. But when I look at what the Navy is doing and what the leadership they're showing in renewable energy, it boosts my spirits back up again. So the Navy, my hat's off to you for this.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary.